All right, I think we are live. It is 9 o'clock. I'm going to pause the preview to get as good a signal as possible. Welcome to another session of P5Live Sessions. Thanks for tuning in now live with me, and hello to those in the future who maybe look back at this archive and are curious to see what happens when we just mess around for an hour improvising with P5JS in this environment, P5Live. I'm going to start a brand new sketch. And yeah, what am I going to mess with today? I mean, this is just going to be improvising every week. There's going to be some different themes, sometimes co-coding, sometimes looking up random references, sometimes just doing visuals. And what I plan to do tonight is play with something that I ran into yesterday while having class with my MDes students here in Basel. And they were curious to learn how layers work inside of processing. And so I demonstrated layers and showed how you could make a layer that was super tiny. Maybe I show kind of roughly in this new fancy Blackboard feature. Whoops. Where is the cursor? There it is. If I make this a little bit bigger, it was sort of like you can make a tiny little canvas, and that could be a layer with some information happening inside of there, and basically you can then show that layer huge on the screen because you don't have to make a layer that's one-to-one the same size as the whole canvas. You could make it just be this little thing or a huge thing. Sometimes if making a poster, I'll make the design way bigger than we can see on screen as a layer and then show it much smaller. So yeah, just demonstrated that and enjoyed just making a really tiny canvas, showing it huge, and getting some interesting, really low res, low pixelation, like pixel graphics, and thought maybe that's a fun spot to start out and just mess around with. So let's begin. I'm going to call this a PG as a reference to processing, where it is P graphics. A quick shout out to processing, where this is going to be a create graphics. And normally if I was making a layer, I'd make it the whole size, but I'm just going to make this small and see what happens. I'm just going to recreate what I made for that demo and then start going from there and improvise and see where this thing can go, because we ran out of time that day. And so it's super fun just to keep going. So the idea was that there was a background that's just kind of fading or just doing something. And then drawing on this P graphic. So the P graphic had a stroke. We made it not floor, we just rounded a random number to 1 times 255. So the stroke is like either black or white. And then drew a point. And this point had a random PG width, had a random PG height. And then the whole thing was that we draw on these layers, and then you have to show the layer. So then we have to say image PG00. And technically there, we can barely see it. I'm going to zoom into the screen, see if the menu goes away. There's our tiny little P graphic hanging out there in the corner. But the fun happens when you start to say, hey, draw it across the whole page, width and height. And there we go. I'm just taking this little, it's a 10 by 10 pixel layer, and I'm drawing it huge. And then to get into pixel graphics, I just have to say no smooth, and then we get these not harsh, but hard edged pixels that could do anything. They could be any color. We can suddenly throw some color into these things and say, hey, it's like a random shade of green and yellow, or it's some shade of white or magenta. Yeah, we can play with all kinds of colors in there. And basically it's just drawing on top of a layer right now that could be visible or not visible. There's technically a background. If I go pg.clear, then we can see where it's dropping this little point and what's really happening. We're just drawing on a layer and seeing a background behind it. But it's quite fun to, to draw this little graphic that could be any size. Here it is 10 by 10, and so I'm getting kind of we found out that we're getting kind of stretched out rectangular pixels. But if I want to be square, then I should just use some relation of the width and height. So I could go width divided by 10, height divided by 10. That's already cool, just doing the width divided by 10. And now they're fairly small pixels, and to get them bigger, just divide by a bigger number. 50, let's go 100, 100. And we're getting close back to where we were, and now they're square because our P graphic is in the same relation as the same aspect ratio as the whole canvas. And so now a point really is a point. It's like a square point. Yeah, so that's kind of where we left off, and we just played with what happens if these are different values. We can get huge pixels happening, smaller pixels, and now it's the improvising time. Take it from here, because maybe it's interesting to be able to have multiples of these, to like layer them, and maybe we could see through some of them. Like when I have this guy on, we don't have to fill it up quite so quickly. Maybe I just make how often it adds a point happen once in a while, and then stack a few of these things behind each other, or put them as texture on some 3D shape and see what that's like, pixelated 3D graphic textures. But it's an excuse to play with pixelation because, yeah, we can. So I can make this thing smooth again, and this is really interesting here in P5Live. We have this soft compiling, and so in draw I can just change my mind, and the draw is getting updated so I can get fuzzy graphics, fuzzy pixels, or nice sharp pixels. And let's see, so what do I want to do? Let's draw two of these things and see what happens when we can see through from one to another, and maybe eventually have to move into like a 3D environment with WebGL. But I'm gonna end up trashing everything when I add a new global variable. Goodbye, it comes back pretty quickly. So now I have PG2, and I'll say PG2 equals, let's copy paste, and then eventually it might be interesting to use a different aspect ratio, to have some bigger pixels and smaller pixels hanging out there. And I will tell maybe PG2 gets the same thing. It's also random. Oops, I forgot to say PG2. It didn't know what it was. And so now PG2 also has a random stroke. Maybe I'll do it beneath it so it's kind of organized. And I'll do the same thing with PG2. And then I need to draw it. So PG1 and PG2. So we can't even tell that there's a difference because they're both random black and white pixels. Maybe I introduce that color again, and then we can kind of see maybe one is eventually covering up the other one. I think we've just totally covered up PG1, so I can't even see it. So maybe this shouldn't happen quite so often, or maybe instead of just being random anywhere on the page, I could play with like a little random walker, because random walkers are fun. So instead of totally random, let's use noise. And that'll cause maybe even slower noise. This will cause something to just kind of wander around the page, and I'm going to copy and steal that snippet. I technically don't need that parenthesis. Paste and give it a slightly different number so it's not a diagonal. There, and now we've got this thing hanging out on top, which is, I can just quickly turn off one of those layers. This is now our layer 2, which is just kind of walking around, kind of plopping one of its either yellow or green to that layer. I could always restart it by saying pg2.clear and then let it leave a new trail. Maybe that would be nice to turn on and off sporadically. We can check out what that other one was doing. Maybe I copy paste this and let both of them be walkers, or maybe it's good to turn that off so I could turn it back on. And give this the same thing, and it needs to have somehow different values, or else it'll be in the exact same trajectory as the first one. So now technically they're two walkers going and doing their own thing, little pixel walkers. Yeah, and I'm already curious what this thing looks like in 3D, because in my head I kind of imagine these to be able to see through them and have some kind of perspective. Whether that works or not, I'm not sure. So let's see how much we have to change to turn to WebGL. WebGL, now everything is off in the side. We maybe don't get to play with no smooth. That'll be interesting. And then I'm gonna say image mode center. So everything is in the center of the page. There we go. And I don't know if I can say no smooth. It might be about this WebGL anti-aliasing. Ooh, I forget what that is exactly, what the code is. Set attribute. That is for something else. Set attributes. Yeah, there it is, anti-aliasing false or true. Let's see if this does what I hope it does. Set it false. Damn. Okay, that's a bummer that in 3D mode we can't have these sharp graphics that I hoped to have. There must be a way. The question is how. Yeah, but let's make some of these things bigger than the other, or just kind of moving around and see what happens. Maybe just having these things move around will give me that similar effect of kind of a parallaxy seen through the thing. So I'm going to say translate width divided by 2, height divided by 2, so they're in the center. And let's get some movement happening to one of them. Maybe the one in the back, I will give a sign. Frame count times 0.01 times width divided by 2. Maybe a lot less. Just have it slowly rock a bit back and forth in the background. So now we've got this kind of movement happening. Maybe 10, just has to be like a little bit moving around. Let's do the height and have this thing going at a slightly different speed, or just kind of doing a movement around behind the thing. Let them start out again. Dancing. Pixel graphics. That's okay. I think I'll pause it and come back to that idea. And maybe play first with different ratios. Test out what happens when these things have different relationships with each other. So technically this should be half as big as the other. That's interesting. Maybe they don't quite line up if they're in the center. Let me make a 10th as big. Almost need to get running quicker in order to get more things happening there. Maybe I let this one be random again. That's a problem. This guy was on a point. It was placing a point based on the PG1 width. I should use its own width. There we go. Maybe that's why things weren't quite lined up before. So let's go back to 50. Back to 50. Nah, maybe it's about centering these things is throwing things off. Let's go back to 0 and turn off this image mode. Nope, they still don't quite line up, but that's also interesting. The way that they don't line up could offer some interesting texture. So let's put things back in the center, just kind of undoing, redoing. So, oops, too much undo. All right, I'm going to take away the color from this and see what happens when these overlap and leave kind of an offset of grids with each other. So this creates kind of a, we had those pixels, but now it's like a bit of noise around where one of those pixels would have been to get some almost artifact to the pixel. Interesting. I'm going to play with some feedback with this setup, because maybe it's interesting having just these really low res graphics and then doing a bit of feedback to them so that they have their position where they're supposed to be, and then I tell them expand upon that. So let me add a let FB for feedback and tell this FB to equal create graphics of the width and the height. It's going to be the full size of the canvas. Down here, FB is going to be a get from 0, 0 to width and height. Hopefully it doesn't get too slow. And then after my background, I'm going to show this image and hope it works. Image FB 0, 0. And then it's interesting to show it as big as it is, plus minus a bit of scale. Scale equals 1.01. So this thing zooms in a little bit or zooms out. The question is, where exactly I'll need to put this. Interesting. Why am I not seeing this image appear? Create graphics. There, I grab the thing. Maybe I need to tell it to be in the center of the page because we're not translated. There we go. Whoa, zooming way in. Let's zoom out slower. Okay. Interesting. I'm going to turn off one of our feedback layers. Yeah, feedback is always fun to play with in either zooming in or zooming out. Do the opposite, that these things kind of slide down. This might give an illusion of that each of these things are kind of 3D tower-like things that are kind of having some depth to them. Let's go back to the noise point and see what that was like when it's just kind of this slightly walking around thing, zooming out. I actually don't see the thing at all because it's maybe so centered. So maybe if I say minus 50, whoa, way too much. Minus 1 gives me a little bit of perspective, maybe even 0.5. It only needs a little bit. I can start it over just to see what that does. That now it's just kind of like bleeding some visual feedback slightly up centered. And these are points, so I can't really put an outline on it, but what could be interesting is what it looks like when it's suddenly smoothed. And this is no longer such a pixelated graphic. Go back to the smooth. Introduce some color into it. Maybe this big block form is too much, so I'll size things down a bit. Yeah, and this could be interesting, just playing with the amount of distortion happening here. If this is a minus versus a plus, we'll give these things a 3D dimension down in that direction. This walker creates like an island in the middle, so let me try the random again. And maybe it's about not doing it too often, saying like if frame count modulo, where's modulo? 60 equals 0, so just once a second it's allowed to build one of these little blocks. Maybe a bit more than that. Every half second, drop me one of these things. I could try adding a bit of background over that feedback image. Could be interesting, and then it like fades that feedback I had slowly out. So it's slowly covering it up with just a little bit of opacity. Yeah, but I have a feeling it's interesting when this isn't fixed, that it's either going up or down or a little bit to the side or the other side. It might be nice to let this be a sine wave as well, so it can grow just a little bit by a positive or negative number. So like this, it can drift a little bit to the right or left, and here it can drift a bit up or down. So now it just kind of has like a bit of motion on its own. I'll have it zoom out a little bit faster. And I'll start it over once more just to see what this looks like with this background on. Maybe let's add our second point and see what's happening with that thing. Whoa, there's a lot of graphic on it. So I'm going to clear it. Ooh, that's interesting. Now this one isn't building up anything. It's just kind of doing its walking. If I let it build up. Yeah, it's getting a little bit too covered up too quickly from these different pixels. So I'm going to tell this to keep clearing and let it be bigger. I just saw it for a second, but it disappeared. Because I need to use its own width and height. That was a problem earlier. There we go. They start to look like fries going off into the distance. Yeah, I don't know if I'm so excited about what this thing is doing. I think I'm gonna tweak this and maybe turn these pixels back into a 3D texture and see if we can play with some WebGL with these pixelations. Okay, so let's just quickly give this a name. Let's just call this pixelated feedback, and clone it and turn off a bunch of this stuff. I'm going to turn off our feedback, or maybe I can just disable this stuff for now. I can turn that off. I can turn this off. Interesting. This is what it's like without the feedback. It looks like something quite different. Oops, I didn't want that. Okay, and I'm going to stop showing those images directly, because instead they're going to be applied as a texture to some 3D object and see what that looks like. So let me throw myself into a WebGL and hope the laptop can hang with all of this. I don't need to translate, and I'm going to say, let's have a texture that is PG and just check out what a sphere looks like with no stroke. No stroke. I think this no smooth doesn't make, it does make a difference. If I start this thing over, yep, it is making some kind of a fuzz difference. So this thing is now applied as a texture on a stroke of a sphere, so I can do a little bit of rotation just so that we can see that texture that is applied to this thing. Kind of making a disco ball. We can put ourselves inside of it is always fun. Has an interesting glow to it from this low pixel quality. These things were so big. I'll quickly test out what it's like when they're much bigger. We get a different kind of glow. That's quite nice as well. And let's go back to just this black and white pixels in there, or maybe shades of gray. Just drop off the rounding and let this be different shades of gray going around this circle. And let's have 2 of them. It could be interesting to let one of them go in the opposite direction. There's something interesting happening every once in a while. It's kind of giving this little like change to the amount of glow that they have. I'm not quite sure what that's about. Maybe that's about this background that I have applied here. If I turn off this big one, okay, it's kind of maybe leaving a trace. Oh yeah, we can see through the thing. Interesting, so they are leaving a trace. That's kind of cool that these pixels are dragging something off in the distance. So maybe they need yet another rotation. Almost looks like Tetris pieces hanging out there as a texture. I could give 2 different textures to these things. If I'm still generating something on PG2, then I could see what this one's like when its texture is our other graphic. It calmed down because it was doing this walker instead of just random. Looks like spotlights shining on this thing from different angles. It's because it's clearing. That's why it's not leaving a trail. If I turn off that clear there, then we get this building up and building up this texture. Let's change this one to a box. That's quite interesting. We can see through this thing. Let's do a bit of orbit control to have some control over spinning. Maybe I just make this temporarily mouse X. Ooh, it didn't like that box. Interesting, it tried to compile while I was typing X. There we go. Yeah, that gives some interesting quality. I can sort of be leaving a trace there and then zooming way into the thing. Now it's almost, I think it's cutting into each other. The square is kind of cutting into the face of the sphere on the outside, so we get this portal like quality, which I could spin around. It's interesting letting these 2 shapes sort of collide with each other. Pixel Rubik's Cube could probably make this thing with RGB and a couple other colors go in that direction. Let me test out just some different shapes. A torus. Or just a plane. What is a plane like? Just to see that thing floating in space. If I turn off the sphere, it'll leave a trace of itself out there. Start it over again. So now there's just a couple dots. It's like regenerated itself. Yeah, but this is actually towards the direction I think I was imagining a while ago, that this texture is spinning in kind of 3D, and then we can see the different textures with each other, maybe spinning at different speeds. So maybe I do the same thing For the second texture, let's also give it the size of the canvas as a plane. Whoa, it's got this other rotation going. Let's turn that off. Spinning in different directions, let's just keep it going the same direction, but maybe it's a little bit ahead of the other one. And maybe it needs to have a different color so we can tell this thing is just black and white. But let me do like frame count modulo 250. But it's also going way too fast. So I should also slow it down so it doesn't fill up the canvas quite so quickly. Let's start it over. So it's only giving every once in a while one of these dots. And they're way bigger than the other one, so it ends up leaving, yeah, kind of this splotchy background. Because it's huge, maybe I make it the same size and see what it's like with just two of them at the same size as each other. So they're leaving similar motion graphics. Let's have it be 90 degrees ahead. So we have the sort of grayscale layer and the color layer. It's also interesting to slow the things down so they have more of a chance to leave a trace. But in the end, it actually leaves less of a trace because maybe the edges are covering that up. Maybe I'm going to say push and pop. So that one is spinning in such a direction. And I'll tell this one to move in the X direction. Nope. Let's put it back. Disable that. Now they're both going in the exact same direction. They're sort of overlapping each other, spinning around together, and then could have one of them be translated a bit in front of the other. So it could be 0, 0, and maybe it's 10 or 50 in front of the other layer. Let me start them over. There it is. So it's sitting 50 in front of the other layer. And I guess we can only see it when it's in one direction. It gets hidden behind the other one, maybe because of this depth test of WebGL. So I could also just do it twice. I could have it in front and behind of the other layer. So now one of them is 50 in front, one is 50 behind it. Okay, so that's them spinning around. If I stop the spinning and just play with them in 3D space, that's kind of interesting. Seeing what these things look like. I wish we could have harder graphics there, harder edged graphics. I'm not quite sure what one has to do with WebGL to get that to happen. Let's let them generate again. It's also worth testing again to do some Z fighting. So if I did like a sphere that is 400, let me turn these ones off for a sec. I have this other texture and do a sphere that's 400. technically they're on the exact same space, and then maybe they would do some sort of Z fighting ripping into each other, but maybe not because they're so low pixel poly. Now these things are really low res in the width direction, but pretty small in the height. That also creates something interesting, almost like a reflection on some kind of a globe. Trashy when I move it. Start it over. If I have a sphere surrounding them now, so now I have the ones going in the center, and I threw one more sphere at the outside surrounding this whole thing. And now I wonder if I turn this thing, yeah, it leaves a trail behind. Interesting to see it at such a rotation. I know it starts itself over. I'd have to twist it again. Let me turn this to a reddish color. Make this thing even smaller. I could add another one. Maybe with a push and pop around it, so just that one goes really fast. I start it over, one of the spheres is going with the same texture extra quick around this thing. Starts to look like the beginning of some news TV show, almost like the Daily Show kind of intro. It also kind of looks like muscle tissue happening in the background there, or cables, solid, all kinds of network cables running in different directions. Or spaghetti in space. Let's see, we had our different texture. Oh, one was just a grade scale. Let me give some color to that stroke as well. Start it over, see what it looks like. different shades of yellow in there. Bring back the spaghetti pasta in space. Where is this going? No idea. Let's add a plane and see what that does. So it's good those things were still there and could just turn them on and off. That's kind of interesting. This layer that it ends up building, wrapping around. I'm going to turn off this inner sphere for a minute. So we just have this spinning texture now. I think there must still be some sphere on. I still see something spinning there. This one here. If we go back to just a shade of gray, which texture is being used? We're actually using texture 1. Maybe I try a grayscale again. Now it's slowly going to introduce this gray into that color. I can also tweak it, see what happens when I bend it a little bit. Yeah, one moment it looks like deep shelves, and then all of a sudden it shows off how flat this thing is. And let's start it over. It's always nice to refresh the whole thing once and just let it get a clean slate. Building from scratch. We still have a yellow line in there from something. That is this PG2, and that is on our sphere on the outside. Okay, so we have like a little bit of color being introduced to the outside. Maybe I will override that PG2 dot stroke. Yeah, and with this setup, maybe it's interesting to keep playing with what these different pixel kind of grid ratios can be from this pixelation. If I suddenly make this thing way thicker, it looks like splotches, spinning around splotches. Interesting, it really gained a lot from having that thin, fine line. So we could bring that even finer. Before I was playing with half of the width and height, and I'm curious what happens if I just let it be the full width and height. It's going to be probably there's going to be just tons of moire patterns appearing because now it's in WebGL and it's got a lot of fine texture lines that it can overlay. That's what it's doing in one direction. Maybe change it to an X direction for rotation. Creates an interesting depth of rings where that sphere is off in the distance. Let me temporarily turn off the plane so we only have that circular shape. Yeah, it looks really metallic now. That's interesting. Just from this this resolution of texture being applied, we get such a metallic-like color. It's wild. Maybe I also tell it to rotate. That was on a push and pop. Let's let it also rotate outside of this push and pop. But maybe much, much lower. So it just barely is having a rotation, or maybe a Z rotation might be what I was actually after. Nope, but that's interesting. Yeah, it looks like all these intricate layers. Reminds me a bit of Kimchi and Chip's thread projection work. When you see this at the side, I think it was 4,000 lines projection. But wild metallic colors happening there. It's always interesting then to maybe just quickly look at what that texture is. This is all based on texture 2. Let's quickly check out that image. Image PG200. I think that's all it is just this little really high res thin band. If I look back at how I created it, it's the width divided by 150, so it's that part. And then height. Yeah, wild. Ooh, look at what that image is doing there. That's pretty trippy. It almost looks like a spectrograph. So I can turn it off. Yeah, I'm quite happy with what it is leaving behind. I think once in a while I should press Control S to save this thing out. But there's still 8 minutes to go, so that means I have to ruin it and take it somewhere else and mess with it. Maybe the sphere at different sizes is also interesting to keep playing with. To keep playing with this exact same texture and bring back some of these spheres at different sizes. If I bring back this one that was in the middle, looks like so. Maybe it's nice to have another one that's equally as big, so 2 of them will be that size, but then tell one of those to go in this other rotation. Maybe I move that Z rotation down below, or maybe they both need it. And then maybe they're both going to be using this X and Z, and then tell one of them to spin on another axis. That's kind of interesting. Now it's like stabbing into each other, the different spheres. Kind of wild how sharp all of a sudden this got from being so pixelated before. But I'm going to put that rotation back where it was, and I'm going to add a different rotation to this second sphere, because maybe I want actually like a rotate Y. Frame count divided by 2. Nope, I probably want a rotate X maybe. No, maybe it was Y. It's kind of strange that it looks so stuttered. Let's go back to Y. Oh, uppercase Y. Damn, it has to rebuild itself. But that's going to be interesting as well, to watch it rebuild this thing. We had this huge, nice, fancy texture built up. And luckily, as we were smooth compiling, it was staying around the whole time. But now we have to build this thing up again. Yeah, it also looks a lot like scrims. Those are these interesting materials in projection on a stage, kind of like a mosquito net. I wonder what that would look like. I'm sure there's great projects just layering a bunch of those in front of each other, different levels of metallic. Okay, it's slowly coming back. Yeah, it really had built up for a while and got so complex. I have to look again at what I was having it do. This PG2 is just doing a random point. And I'll activate this rotation again. And maybe it's just going too fast and it needs to go way, way, way less. But it's interesting, this kind of stopping moment that it makes. I wonder why that's happening. No idea. If I told this thing to be frame count, create something else. Times 5. Let's go. Instead of trying to slow it down, I bet this is just going to crush the compression of this stream. Enjoy the super messy, blurry pixels. I'm skeptical that it will be as sharp as I see it here. Maybe. But that's interesting. At about 1 times speed of the frame count, it looked kind of choppy, and then we can just go even further beyond that, and suddenly this thing becomes kind of a cyclone. Nope, I think we're going too high up. I think it was good somewhere around 5 to 10, sort of gives us this inside the dryer simulation. Yep, it's nice with it, it's nice without it, just letting it be these smooth graphics rolling around. I'm a fan of both. Save a couple more outputs from this. $15 wasn't so bad. Taking a couple screenshots. What does this look like if I put that other texture on this one? I wonder what has been happening on texture 1. Is it still doing anything? It had this random... maybe that was why this one was so nice, because it was totally random all the way from black to white. But these are super similar, so and the sizes are also the same. So technically PG1 should be pretty interesting to look at. Plain old PG. I can turn off the other sphere, and now we just see the first layer, the first pixelated layer. They're similar but different, and that's what they're like together. Let me slow down a rotation on this other one. Yeah, it's interesting. There's these moments where it's super clear vector graphics, and then it sort of pauses and leaves a little bit of a blur, and it tricks me for a minute into seeing this metallic quality hanging out in there. These pauses that you see are while I'm pressing Control S to save a picture out. It sort of pauses for a split second. All right, I'm gonna save this thing before I screw it up and take it somewhere else. So I'm just gonna rename it and call this pixelated metallic texture. Ooh, and something started it over. That's a good question. Does it start over when I rename this thing? Let's call it 2. It does. It probably shouldn't do that. Interesting to learn. I think I'll make that go away on P5Live, because you should be able to rename the thing and not have it erase what you had been drawing. There's probably a reason why that's hanging out there, maybe because it has to refresh everything. But I'll try and make that go away so you could just rename while you still have something built up on these textures. Yeah, at the beginning it was really exciting to play with that plane spinning around. Of course, we have to turn all these things back on and off. It's nice having the things still there to kind of test out what was it like with it, what was it like without it. Of course, it's nice to turn a sphere into a box and see what those things do, but then it's way too small of a box, so it should be a double the size box without the other sphere, and see what just a box is like. But I think there's almost too many hashings throughout it. It gets, yeah, it really became a blurry thing. So I think I'm going to stick with the sphere, go back to a sphere, and with or without this one is a question. Different levels of complexity. Could use one of them to introduce a little bit of color, maybe some chromatic pinks or blues to give it a little bit of lighting in there. I haven't even played with lighting which I turn on for a split second to see what that does. Lights. Gives it a dimmer quality. I should continue playing with directional lights, which I got into a couple weeks ago, and see what that is like and can offer me. But actually prefer it in this case without the lights. Yeah, fun taking this in different directions. We went quite a ways away from those initial pixels. Started out low res, pixelated graphics. I thought we would hang out and finish there, but it was an interesting starting point just to play with layers that are really low res instead of layers that are the full canvas of your main sketch, just messing around with some substrate of that. And with that, I think we wrap up the session. Take one more screenshot. There we go. And thank you for tuning in to P5Live Sessions. We'll be back next Tuesday with something completely different. See you then.